Memoirs of Arthur O Neill, The Second Journey. After remaining some years with my parents and friends in and about Dungannon, I felt an itching for rambling once more. The first place I went to was to a Colonel White of Red Hill in the county of Cavan, with whom I remained 7 years, sometimes with neighbouring gentlemen, particularly with a Mr. Morris Thompson, who lived within a mile and a half of the Colonel's. With him I spent every Saturday night during that period. I spent my time very pleasantly between Colonel White and Mr. Thompson. One Saturday night in particular, I recollect Mr. Thompson was so fond of the tune of Past 1 o'clock that we both tete-a-tete finished 4 bottles of good old wine. I playing the tune all the time, except when lifting my hands to my head. So here's that tune, Past 1 o'clock. Right, so that version of the tune was from about 1740, which is pretty much the same time as around when Arthur was born in 1737. So the uilleann pipe version you just heard there was from around the same time as Arthur's birth. And just for pig iron, like just to be interested in the tune, here's Robert Burns' version of it, which is a little bit later. So this is words put to it. And of course, Burns lived from 1759 to 1796. So it's in and around the same time. So just to hear it sung as a song, it's a little bit slower.
Frosty morning, kind November was o'er the plain. We heard the cowbell repeat the loud warning, as restless I sought for sweet slumber in vain. Up high arose the silver moon shining bright, mountains and valleys heaving all holy white. Forth I would go, mid the pale silent night, one because of my pain. So gently I start to my lovely maid's chamber, and at the window down my knee, begging that she would.
So that's what he recollected with Mr. Thompson. On one Saturday night in particular, I recollect Mr. Thompson was so fond of the tune Past 1 o'clock that we both tete-a-tete finished 4 bottles of good old wine, I playing the tune all the time, except when lifting my hand to my head. I formed the idea of remaining with the Colonel during his life, he being a bachelor, and some said a woman hater. There was a fellow named William Saunderson, by origin a relative of Colonel Saunderson, and there's a little note about him. This was the ancestor of the Unionist leader and orator, the Earl Colonel Edward Saunderson, whose statue has been erected in Portadown, County Armagh in March 1910 in recognition of his political services during the Parnellite era. It is interesting to find that in the 18th century, the Saundersons, who may be described as Cromwellian settlers, were patrons of Irish harpers. So he says, this fellow William Saunderson, by origin a relative of Colonel Saunderson's. This fellow conducted all Colonel White's domestic concerns, though no scholar. This fellow got jealous of me, as the Colonel was very fond of me. He was eternally tale-bearing to him. There was a Munster girl named Winnie Burke, a housemaid there, on whom this Saunderson pressed his attentions. She very prudently resisted him, and to mortify him the more, told him that she preferred me. This so exasperated him the more, and he became so disagreeable to me that I determined to leave the Colonel, much against his will. During the time I remained with the Colonel, I went to Colonel Saunderson, about 2 miles distant, where I spent about a month. On my return to Red Hill, there was a general report through the house that my room was haunted, which the Colonel himself told me, but I insisted on sleeping in the same room, which I did. I was not long in bed when I heard a strong and curious noise in the chimney. I bounced out of the bed and groped to the place, thrust my hands up and caught a large owl which had a nest in the chimney that by some means fell down. The owl lay quiet all day, but endeavoured to get up by night, making frightful noise in the effort, which confirmed the superstitious servants that it must be a ghost. However, I secured the poor bird and brought it down to the Colonel, who seemed so well pleased that he put 15 guineas into my hand, saying that he would not for anything have it reported that his house was haunted. When I left the Colonel, I steered through the chief part of the county of Cavan, from one gentleman's seat to another, without carrying my own harp, as there was scarce a gentleman's house I touched at, but there was one. The Harpers found in that country were Ned McCormick, James McGovern, Owen Clark, Patrick Maguire, Simon Hunter, Phil Riley, Francis Riley, John Clark, Ned Brady, Michael Duignan, Nellie Smith, Kate Martin, Paddy Kerr and Owen Corr. McCormick was by far the best harper of them all. In the county Tyrone I met 3 brothers named Ned, James and Frank McAleer, who all played very well on the harp, but Ned was far the best. He was very comical. He lived upwards of 5 years in France in the Irish Brigades, and would sometimes assume the title of the celebrated Liriano from Paris, as he could speak the French language very fluently. He was a slave to that pernicious beverage that generally leaves itinerants in that situation, that they will either pledge their own or any gentleman's harp sooner than want it. Pox on you, Caroline. You must certainly have been half mulvardered when you composed your receipt for drinking whisky. Otherwise, I am sure you would never have been a composer, as the effect of that cordial had so happy an effect on you that your ideas floated faster on you than might have done if there was no such liquor to be had. And this is Caroline's receipt for drinking. At one time, when poor Ned McAleer assumed the name of Liriano, he went to a councillor, Stewart, of Baileyborough in the County Cavan, which time Harry Fitzsimmons, the harper, was there. Liriano was announced. He was ordered to play in the hall as a specimen, where there were some tailors then at work for their servants. Liriano began to play some Irish tunes, jigs, reels, etc. Mrs. Stewart, after some time, came from the parlour to the hall and told him she was much disappointed, as some of her own countrymen could excel him. McAleer, chagrined, started up and exclaimed, "Madam, as you were pleased to order me to play in the hall, I played you tailors' and servants' music, which would otherwise be different. Damn your soul, you trumping rascal," says one of the snips, bouncing off the floor, and was going to destroy poor McAleer with his goose. And if it was not for some interference, he was determined to avenge the mighty insult. Fitzsimmons knew McAleer, who undeceived Mrs. Stewart respecting his foreign descent, and was probably jealous with him, as McAleer was much the best performer. When I left the County Cavan, I rambled into the county of Tyrone, where I fell in occasionally with different harpers. The first and best who claimed my attention was poor Paddy Ryan, my dear lamented friend, next to Hugh O'Neill, hereinafter mentioned. His father was a Munster man and an excellent performer, and indeed Paddy was not inferior to any man I ever heard on the harp. He was not blind, and, exclusive of what I knew and was informed of him, he was pregnant with sentiments of honour and unlimited friendship to every person, which he evinced to me in a particular manner. He was destitute of the low ideas of jealousy common among itinerants. He took pains and taught me several tunes, which, however, I now forget. I met my old master, Owen Keenan, who was glad to see me. I also met Hugh Quinn, who was taught by Con Lyons. He was a gentleman's son, and as such conducted himself, and was one of the best of Lyons' pupils. He was not blind. I met a John McRory, a blind harper, who was a middling player. I met my namesake, Peggy O'Neill, who played very decently on the harp. She played all Carolyn's planksties extremely well. I met Charles Bourne. So a little note about Charles Bourne. It says the harper who competed at the Granard and Belfast festivals, sometimes called Berrien. So I met Charles Bourne, who was taught by his uncle on the harp. This man had many advantages, not being blind. He was a good player. He had an excellent memory and could recount all the little incidents that happened to him during the time he led his blind uncle through the kingdom. I heard him sing a good many Irish songs in an agreeable style and pleasing voice. Arthur Short was the next and last harper I met in the county of Tyrone at this time. He was not quite blind. The first specimen I heard of his abilities was at my father's house. He was but an indifferent performer. This man was very peevish. He generally travelled without a guide. I was informed he was about 100 times married, but never heard how many children he had. I was informed he had one son who was a performer beyond the common. I knew and met Hugh Higgins in all my peregrinations. And a little bit about Hugh Higgins. He was a competitor at the Belfast Festival in 1792. He supported the character of a gentleman harper, was uncommon genteel in his manners, and spared no expense in his dress. He travelled in such a manner as does and will do credit to an Irish harper. Hugh was born in a place called Tirally in the county of Mayo, of very decent parents. His mother's name was Burke. He lost his sight at an early period and was bound to learn the harp, on which my dear deceased friend made such a proficiency as to rank him one of the best I ever heard. When I left the counties of Cavan and Tyrone, I formed a notion of going into the county of Roscommon in Connacht to see my dear friend Hugh O'Neill. We met by appointment at a Mr. MacDonald's of Knockrantry in that county, who saw an immensity of the first company to be had. There was at this time, which was about 30 years ago, a patron, or kind of meeting, or a patron. I'll just say that again. There was at this time, which was about 30 years ago, a kind of patron, or kind of meeting, not unlike a fair, held in that quarter, and Mr. MacDonald's house was full of company when I met Hugh there. Amongst the rest of the guests, there was a young nobleman from Germany named the Marquis of Devian. I was curious to know the cause of his coming to Ireland, and was informed he fell in love with a beautiful lady in his own country, but his parents not approving of the match, they diverted his attention from it by sending him over to this kingdom to take possession of an estate in the county Roscommon in right of his mother. From what I myself could guess, and from what an accomplished countryman of my own told me, he was one of the most finished and accomplished young noblemen he ever saw. Hugh and I played our very best tunes for a long time. The Marquis was at a loss how to call for the tune of Past 1 o'clock, or Tommy McCullough nor Urskame, which means I'm in me sleep, don't wake me. So that's the same name for the tune, Past 1 o'clock. I am in my sleep, don't wake me, which he heard played somewhere before. He perceived me going towards the door and followed me, and informed me that there was a man that made boots for him whose name was Tommy McCullough, and it was like the tune by saying Tommy McCullough made boots for me. Oh yeah, Tommy McCullough nor Wooska me. To this fella sounded like Tommy McCullough made boots for me. In the broad way he pronounced it, it was not unlike the Irish name for it. I went in with him and played it, on which he seemed uncommonly happy, and informed the company all around it was his choice. This young nobleman was some time afterwards afflicted with that ugly disease, the smallpox, and Roderick O'Connor, and the then nominal monarch of Connacht, invited the Marquis to his little palace at Clunalis, where, notwithstanding every exertion of the faculty, he died at the age of about 22 or 23 of that disorder. So just a little bit there, a note about Roderick O'Connor. The O'Connors were the kingly family of Connacht. At the time of the Norman invasion, Roderick O'Connor was Ardri, which means High King of Ireland. Harper O Neill is not ironical in his allusion to the regal title and that little palace. Lady Morgan, in her Memoirs, tells of a dinner party at which she met the O'Connor of her day, a legitimate representative of the supreme kings of Ireland as any sovereign on or off his throne at this moment in Europe, who behaved with great coolness towards another guest, the Honourable Mr. French, MP. Pressed by Lady Morgan for an explanation, he poured forth a history of wrong and robbery wrought by the Frenches. But when, said Lady Morgan, did this happen? Lately? Well, not very long ago, in the last years of the reign of Queen Elizabeth. The title of O'Connor Don is still retained, and the late holder of it played a somewhat prominent part in politics. In 1895, the Royal Society of Antiquaries of Ireland, making a western tour, was entertained by the O'Connor Don to a hospitable luncheon within the walls of Ballintubber Castle. The O'Connor Don on that day was, I think it's jubilant over the fact that he had quite recently acquired this castle, which had been out of the possession of his family for a length of time, and it evidently delighted him, in his character of an Irish chieftain, to feast upwards of 100 guests within the ancestral walls. The marquee in which the luncheon was served was pitched inside the ruin. Okay, so on with the memoir. At this time I went no further into Connacht, and made my way home again through the county of Leitrim, where I met John Sneyd, but a very indifferent Harper, in consequence of his being a great thief, so much so that he got the nickname of Long Glue-Fingered Jack. He being very tall, I avoided him. I then made the best of my way to Charles Fanning's father's house, where I met father and son, with whom I remained about 3 weeks, very happy, during which time I attended many weddings and haulings home, where the national customs were all supported with the usual conviviality incident to the circumstances and abilities of the parties. I next came into the county of Cavan, and visited my old friend Colonel White, who received me very well. My old enemy Saunderson was there also, who affected some friendship to me. I next visited my old haunts in that county, and taught some scholars there, one of the best of whom was a Biddy Riley, who was blind, who played very prettily before I quit that county. I next came into the county of Tyrone, and made my way home to my parents, whom I found alive and well. My mother was curious to know whether I saved any money, but my father seemed well content if I returned whole and clean. I was, after this second return from rambling, almost stationary between the counties of Cavan and Tyrone, so much so that I spent 18 successive Christmas days at the house of Philip O'Reilly of the county of Cavan, without meeting with any Harper worth notice but some of those already mentioned. I forgot to mention in its proper place, like many other of my mistakes, that when I was preambulating part of the county of Antrim, I stopped at the Glens, near which I called at the house of Michael MacDonald and Elizabeth MacDonald, otherwise Stuart, his wife. So a little note about these MacDonalds. The father of Dr. MacDonald was son of Alexander MacDonald, son of Call of Volin or Call of the Mill, who had lands in County Antrim after the death of his famous father, the Alistair or Sir Alistair MacDonald, leader in the rising of Montrose, killed at Cernunnos, County Cork, in 1647. This doctor's father lived near Glenarth, County Antrim, and had been twice married. Arthur O Neill mentions his sons of 2 families. So he says there, I was uncommonly well received, and they expressed a desire that their 3 sons, Randall, James, and Alexander, should be taught by me. The hospitality, disinterested friendship, and other favours and attentions shown to me in their hospitable mansion called Val Iske, or Watermouth, was not exceeded in all my peregrinations through this kingdom. Randall MacDonald enjoyed all the sporting comforts that romantic country admitted, and without adulation, not caring a pin into whose hands these unconnected memoirs may fall, he was uncommonly abstemious, abstemious to the toys incident, to the chase, fowling, etc. He made a tolerable proficiency for his time on the harp. James, the now senior doctor, made some proficiency also, but he then appeared to me to have a partiality for some other study, at which I am now happy to be informed ranks him among the class of his profession. Alexander, the now junior doctor, made his best attempt of the three in my opinion, his juvenile years being much in his favour, and before I left him he played very handsomely. I cannot account how I acquired the friendship of the three gentlemen above named, as it always was, and now is, exercised towards me in the most unlimited manner. Long before my starting into the musical world, there were two performers on the harp that almost totally eclipsed everyone mentioned by me heretofore. The first was Murphy, whose father was a hawker of his instrument and an uncommon poor gowl or devil of a player, and as far as I can learn, both father and son were born in Leinster. But as for the son's excellence, I never heard in my travels so much praise given to any harper by all the musicians that heard him. He was well aware of his abilities and never spared an opportunity of boasting of them. He was in France in the reign of Louis XIV, and Murphy's fame reached the ears of that great monarch, who sent for him and was so well pleased with his performance that he rewarded him in a kingly manner, as he himself said. He came home in the dress and style of a great count. His father heard of his being in Dublin, and at last made out where young Murphy was in high company, who was so vexed at his father's shabby appearance that he very dutifully kicked the poor man downstairs. Cornelius Lyons was another great performer, and a very fanciful composer, especially in his variations of the tunes Eileen Arun, Kalina Avok Ahu Harsha, Girl Do You See George, Green Sleeves, The Coolin, and several others. So here's a brief listen to those tunes that he mentioned. The first one there is Eileen Arun. Say Colleen Wakashiv Sarsha, which means girl or girls, have you seen George? Greensleeves. The Coolin. Okay, so it says, well, just before those tunes, it said Cornelius Lyons was the other great performer and a very fanciful composer, especially in his variations of the tunes of Eileen Aroon, Callini Awakahu Saoirse, Greensleeves, The Coolin, and several others. He was a County Kerry man, and by all accounts, he was a superior character to Murphy as a gentleman, and in his profession as a good performer. They were both acquaintances of Caroline's, who could never abide Murphy on account of his lofty impudence. Caroline was one night in Castleblaney in a public house when Murphy strutted in and made some acrimonious speech against Caroline, saying that his compositions were like bones without beef. Damn me, says Caroline in a fret, but I'll compose a tune before I quit you, and you may put what beef you please on the bones of it. With that he left his seat, and cautiously stealing behind Murphy, seized him by the hair of his head, dragged and kicked him through the room unmercifully, during which time Murphy's screeches could be heard at a great distance. Caroline sang to him all the time he was roaring, "Put beef to that air, ye puppy." But for some interference he would not have left a drop in Murphy. It was quite the reverse between Caroline and Lyons, who were on the most intimate footing, as Lyons admired Caroline and his works. But all I ever heard speak of him, By all I ever heard speak of him, he was gentlemanly, civil, good-natured, and obliging to all descriptions, especially to brother Harper's. Lyons was at one time at the house of a Mr. Archdale in the county Fermanagh, at which time Caroline happened to be there, and Lyons heard him composing the tune Mrs. Archdale. And as Caroline could not see him, Lyons wrote down the music as fast as Caroline composed it, which was but middling fast, as on the harp Caroline was no great performer. Mr. Archdale and Lyons planned a joke, which terminated in the following manner. Now, come here, just by the way, as a side thing, I looked up the tune Mrs. Archdale and I couldn't find anyone playing it. So anyway, Mr. Archdale and Lyons planned a joke, which terminated in the following manner. There was an itinerant harper called Charlie Berrien. Now it says about him, the blind uncle of Charles Bourne, or Berrien, mentioned previously, that Caroline detested very much. Mr. Archdale, knowing this to be the case, threw up the window where they were sitting and exclaimed, "Upon my word, here is Berrien coming," which vexed Caroline very much. But upon the expostulation of Mr. Archdale concerning hospitality and the crime attached to the breach of it, Caroline consented to his supposed admission. Lyons had a servant named MacDermott, who could play exceeding well on the harp, and a very humorous fellow. Lyons and MacDermott went into the hall. Lyons took the harp, and MacDermott placed himself behind his master to answer any question Caroline might put to the supposed Berrien, Caroline well knowing Lyons's voice. Lyons began to play the tune of Mrs. Archdale in the poorest manner he could, to imitate Berrien, who was but a poor performer, and MacDermott could well counterfeit his voice. Caroline began to prance and dance with madness about the parlour, and roared out to the supposed Berrien to know where he got the tune. "Och," said MacDermott, "I have that tune this 10 years and upwards." "You're a damned liar and a villain," exclaimed Caroline, "and if it was the devil taught you, you have it only since last night." There was a public stocks near Mr. Archdale's house, and Caroline told Mr. A that if Berrien was not immediately put into them, he would never come near his house, on which Mr. MacDermott made a pretended loud and strong resistance, but was dragged to the stocks, on which he sat down, and a noise was made as if putting in his legs. But Caroline was not yet satisfied without beating the plagiarist, and made a great blow of his cane at him, which MacDermott avoided. At last Caroline suspected he was being deceived, and seemed so unhappy that Mr. Archdale and Lyons had to explain the whole to him, on which he laughed and seemed well satisfied, then shook hands and thanked him for his usual good humour. The present Marchioness of Antrim's great-grandfather and Lyons were almost inseparable. His lordship was both a wit and a poet, and delighted in the system of equality, where vulgarity was not too gross. At one time he and Lyons, when in London, heard of a famous Irish harper named Heffernan, that kept a tavern there. His lordship and Lyons went there, but beforehand they formed the following plan. "I'll call you Cousin Burke," says his lordship. "You may either call me Cousin Randall or my lord, as you please." After regaling for some tirep, Heffernan was called up, who was by the time well aware of the dignity of his guest by the talk and livery of his lordship's servants. When Heffernan came into the room, he was desired to bring in his harp and sit down, which was done. Heffernan played a good many tunes in a grand style, but his lordship, wishing to astonish the landlord, called upon his cousin Burke to play a tune. The supposed cousin made many apologies, but at length took the harp and played some of his best airs, on which Heffernan exclaimed aloud, "My lord, you may call him cousin Burke, or what cousin you please, but damn me, he plays upon lions' fingers." What was extraordinary was that Heffernan never saw lions before. His lordship undeceived Heffernan and desired them to enjoy themselves together and to challenge the world on the harp. He then retired to some other appointment. In my travels I became acquainted with a Dominic Mungan. I may say I had known him since I was 12 years old. He was born blind in the county of Tyrone and a real good harper. He was a Roman Catholic. I presume my following reason will plead an apology for mentioning his religion. He was a great economist, but would spend money as genteelly as any man occasionally. He had 3 sons, Mark, John, and Terence, whom he educated in the first style. Mark was educated for a priest and finished his studies in France in the College of Lombard, where he obtained upward of 40 premiums for his translations of Greek into French. After he finished his studies, he came home, but in consequence of his intense application, he fell into a decay and died in his father's house in Strabane. John, the second son, was bred a physician and practised in and about Monaghan and the adjacent country with good reputation. About 5 years ago, he was returning from the races at Middleton in Monaghan in his gig. He was upset and smashed to pieces. Terence, the third and youngest son, is now Bishop of Limerick and was formerly Dean of Ardagh. He had a good delivery, sung well, and acquired great interest. He and a priest, O'Byrne, who was chaplain to Lord Fitzwilliam when Lord Lieutenant of Ireland, were promoted to their present ranks of Protestant bishops. Now, my reason for mentioning the Roman Catholic persuasion is this, that the doctor and the bishop both read their recantations, the doctor before and the bishop after their father's death. He in his lifetime used to travel the northwest circuit with his harp, and at one time he was playing for one of the judges. He asked Dominic his reasons for not speaking to his son, the doctor, since he turned Protestant. "My lord," said Dominic, "I spared no excuse on him when he was unable to provide for himself, and assure your lordship I am no bigot, but I think it was his duty to consult me before he changed his religion. It was not, however, for the sake of religion he did so, but he fell in love with a young lady who was a Protestant. She informed him she could not have him as he was a papist, on which he read his recantation and then demanded her hand, on which, to his mortification, she scornfully informed him that she would be sorry to marry a turncoat." These anecdotes I merely mention when speaking of Dominic Mungan, without the slightest idea of offending the 2 bishops, more especially as these are well-known facts. When Carolan died, he left an only son and 3 daughters, and these lived in the county of Louth. The celebrated Dean Delaney, and there's a little note about him, the Reverend Patrick Delaney, born in 1686, educated at Trinity College, Dublin, became a friend of Swift's. In 1743, Dr. Delaney, then a widower, married Mrs. Mary Delaney, a widow of literary and social distinction. They lived at Delville in Glasnevin, Dublin, till Dr. Delaney was appointed Dean of Down, when they went to reside in the north. Mrs. Delaney is described as stitching at shirts and shifts for the poor naked wretches in the neighbourhood, whilst cheered by the music of her Irish Harper. This was the son of Caroline referred to by O'Neill. The Dean died in Bath in 1768. Miss Delaney survived till 1788. So the celebrated Dean Delaney delighted in Caroline so much that he took young Caroline by the hand with the intention of opening a subscription for the purpose of defraying all expenses in reviving and recovering all his father's compositions. Young Caroline was but a tolerable performer on the harp, and totally destitute of any talent for composition. However, the Dean never ceased until he obtained a subscription to the amount of £1,600 or thereabouts, on which young Caroline made some attempts to represent his father, but his productions were scandalous, as I often heard the master Caroline, becoming tired of industry after humbugging the good-natured Dean for some time, formed an acquaintance with another man's wife in Ballyman in the county of Longford, took her to London, where I am informed he died. When the residue of the 151,600 was spent or otherwise disposed of between him and his Dulcina. There is an immensity of ancient Irish music lost in consequence of the attachment harpers laterally have for modern tunes, which are now chiefly in vogue, the national airs and tunes being confined to a few gentlemen in the different provinces I have travelled through, and without the most distant idea of any view or interest, I here declare that if it was not in consequence of the unprecedented, I may say truly inspired genius of a gentleman in Belfast, whose name I will have occasion to mention hereafter, the compositions of Dibdin and some other modern composers would, in a very few years, be the means of annihilating our dear Irish music. So that gentleman, the genius of the gentleman that he was referring to of Belfast, was Edward Bunting. I again make bold to say that when the gentleman I allude to will be no more, his laborious exertions to recover and revive our dying Irish music should record him and his memory in a manner much beyond what my poor abilities could attempt to dictate. I heard a few tunes of the gleanings of young Caroline played, which I thought tolerably decent, but when I heard them and the chief part of his father's works played by the gentleman I alluded to, I imagined myself in a manner enchanted. There was a harper before my time named Jerome Duignan, a native of County Leitrim, not blind, an excellent Greek and Latin scholar and a charming performer. I heard numerous anecdotes of him, one of which happened when he lived with a Colonel Jones at Drumshambo, a representative in Parliament for the County Leitrim. The Colonel went to Dublin at the meeting of Parliament, where he fell in company with an English nobleman who brought a Welsh harper with him who played very well. Having played some tunes before the Colonel, the nobleman asked him if he ever heard so sweet a singer. Yes, replied the Colonel, and that a man who never wears either linen or woolen. I would bet you 100 guineas, says the nobleman, you can't produce anyone that can exceed my harper. The bet being taken up, the Colonel wrote immediately for Duignan to Drumshambo to come with all speed to Dublin, and to bring his harp and his suit of cautic, that is, a dress made of beaten rushes, with something like a caddy or plaid of the same stuff. Duignan came post-haste, and on his arrival in Dublin went to the Colonel's lodgings, who acquainted Jeremy and a great number of the members of the House of Commons with the nature of the bet. The members requested it should be decided in the Parliament House before business commenced. The two Harpers performed before the members, and it was unanimously decided in Duigan's favour, particularly by the English nobleman, who exclaimed, "Damn you, why don't you wear better clothes?" "Och," says Duigan, "I lost my all by a lawsuit, and my old nurse, for spite, won't let me wear any other clothes." "Damn me, but you shall," said the nobleman, and then putting a guinea in his own hat, he carried it round through the other members, who every one threw in a guinea each, so that the hat was nearly half full, and the sum was put into Duigan's pocket. Duigan was in full Celtic dress, and he wore a cap of the same stuff. It just has a little note there about this stuff, this Celtic, which is quite interesting. It says, "A material woven of the pith of rushes, a dress of straw used by the Kerry country people in rustic sports, has been added to the collection of the National Museum, Dublin. Mr. George Coffey, director of the Irish section, aims at illustrating the folk customs of modern days as well as prehistoric and ancient life. This rush dress has a high conical cap, like that worn of Jerome Duigan." Right, so it says, "Duigan was in full Celtic dress and wore a cap of the same stuff, shaped like a sugar loaf, with many tassels. He was a tall, handsome man, and looked very well in it. Poor Jeremy contrived to spend the chief part of his money before he left Dublin. I knew an Auckland Keane, a blind harper," and the note about him says, "Eckland Keane, i.e. Ackland Keane or Eckland O'Cahan, the same person who was referred to in a larger page as having been presented with the harp key of Rory Dahl O'Cahan." So he says, "I knew an Ackland Keane, a blind harper, a native of Drogheda, who was taught by Lyons, and an excellent performer. He travelled the chief part of the continent, as he informed me. He played for the Pretender in Rome. From thence he travelled into France, and thence to Spain, in which last place he was uncommonly well received and treated. He might have been happy if it had not been for his great attachment to drinking, by which means he lost all his consequence. At first the Irish in Madrid dressed him like a Spanish don with a servant, and he was introduced to his most Catholic Majesty and played for him. The king had some notion of settling a pension on him in compliment to the Irish, but in consequence of his turning out to be an irreclaimable drunkard, the royal promise melted away into oblivion. He then came to Bilbao. He always carried his harp himself. He was tall, strong, and athletic, and absolutely beat the post in an expedition from Madrid to Bilbao. After staying some time, he embarked for Ireland, where I frequently met him. I was informed by General Campbell in Armagh that Ackland Keane died in Scotland. I forgot to mention in its proper place that the Duke of Argyll, and a note about him, who lived in Queen Anne's reign. It said the Parliamentary Union of Scotland and England, which passed the English House in March of 1707, had been opposed in Scotland by an extraordinary amalgamation of parties. Defoe, author of Robinson Crusoe, who was present and witnessed many of the scenes of mob violence and demonstration against the Union rights. It was the most monstrous sight in the world to see the Jacobite and the Presbyterian, the persecuting prelatic non-jurors and the Cameronian, the Papist and the Reformed Protestant parley together, join interests and concert measures together. Amongst Scottish peers promoting the Union were the Duke of Queensberry and Argyll. The Duke of Hamilton, a Jacobite, vigorously led the opposition till his actions was checked by a message from James, the elder pretender, who, anxious to conciliate his half-sister Queen Anne, signified that he had no objection to the intended union. Right, so it says, so he says, I forgot to mention in its proper place that the Duke of Argyll, who lived in Queen Anne's reign, heard of the celebrity of Heffernan, the London tavern keeper, that played for Lord Antrim, and came to his tavern with a large company to hear him play. The Duke called for a Scotch tune, and Heffernan, being of a good Irish turn of mind, played him the Golden Star, which is a very plaintive Irish tune. So back to the story. The Duke called for a Scotch tune, and Heffernan, being of a good Irish turn of mind, played him the Golden Star, which is a very plaintive Irish tune. His lordship said it was too melancholy for a Scotch tune. "Oh, my lord," said Heffernan, "you must know it was composed since the Union." His allusion was to the Duke being the counterpart of Lord Castlereagh in planning the Union of Scotland, and that the Golden Star was the most appropriate tune he could play for such lovers as would barter their country's honour for the temporary use of that tangent but useful and corrupted metal. The Duke started up and hastily quitted the tavern of the plain-spoken Hibernian with his company. Then it says there that Heffernan's innuendo in answering the Duke of Argyll had reference to the fact that a sum of £20,000 had been sent from the English Parliament to be dispensed in softening the opposition to the Act of Union. Right, back to the memoirs. I wish I myself may have an opportunity of playing the same tune for Lord Castlereagh. I knew a Michael Keane, a blind harper, who was born in the County Mayo in Connacht. He was a decent performer. He left his country for America with a Governor Dobbs of Castle Dobbs in the County of Antrim, who was appointed to the government of South Carolina previous to the American independence. Keane returned from America, and Sir Malby Crofton told this story of Keane, that when he and some other officers were garrisoned at Fort Oswego and had a party, Keane was with them and quarrelled with them and beat them very well and took a Miss Williams from them all. He left the governor and came back to his native country, which he longed to see. I have heard of Ruairí Gáil Ó Cian, blind Roger Keane, and a little note about him. It says, the O'Cahans were one of the most important clans of the north, owing allegiance to the O'Neills. The reference of the great harper Rory O'Cahan for the person of the O'Neill as a greater man than James, King of Scotland and England, is comprehensible to readers of old Irish historical literature. When Brian O'Neill, the last who was acknowledged as a king of Ireland, died in a battle against the Normans in the streets of Downpatrick, his body was surrounded by the corpses of all the leading warriors of the clan O'Cahan. Their territory was in the present County Derry, on the borders of Tyrone, a district confiscated and planted by the London companies. James, when King of Scotland, had secretly encouraged and profited by the war waged by Hugh O'Neill by Elizabeth. When he ascended the throne of England, it was expected that he would show favour to the Irish chief. These expectations proved vain, and the lands of Ulster were confiscated and the great plantation took place. The mention of O'Neill's name by the Harper should have brought the blush of shame to the king's face. Rory Dahl died in Scotland at Castle Eglinton about 1653. So he says, I have heard of Ruairí Gáil Ó Cian. He was born in the county of Derry, a gentleman of large property and heir to an entire barony in that county. He was titled by the O'Neill Area de O'Cahan before he inherited his estates, which were Coleraine, Garva, Newton, Limavady, Kilray and several others. He showed a strong inclination for the harp, and by the time he came to his estate he was an excellent performer. He lived in a splendid style in those days, in James I's reign. He took a fancy to visit Scotland, where there were a great many harpers. He took his retinue or his suite with him. Amongst other visits, in the style of an Irish chieftain, he paid one to a lady Eglinton, and she, not knowing his rank, in a peremptory manner demanded a tune, which he declined, as he only came to amuse her, and in an irritable manner left the house. However, when she was informed of his consequence, she eagerly contrived a reconciliation and made an apology. The result was that he composed a tune for her ladyship, the handsome tune of Da mihi ma'anam, Give Me Your Hand, for which his fame reached through Scotland and came to the ears of the gunpowder prophet James I of England, then the sixth of Scotland. O'Kane delighted him so much that the crabbed monarch walked towards him and laid his hand upon his shoulder, which one of the courtiers then present observed to Roger. What, says O'Kane, somewhat nettled, a greater man than ever James was, laid his hand on my shoulder. Who's that, says the king. O'Neill, my liege, says Kane, standing up. So it says the result was that he composed a tune for her, the ladyship. This is Lady Eglinton, a handsome tune called Da mihi ma'anam. He composed several fine tunes in Scotland, particularly Port Athol and Port Gordon. The ports are uncommon fine tunes. Port means a lesson in music. I played them once, but now forget them. Roger died in Scotland in a nobleman's house where he left his harp and silver key to tune it. And then it says, Rory Dahl's harp key was seen by Dr. Johnson when on his tour with Boswell in the Hebrides. He came to the home of MacDonald of Sleat. So here's Port Athol. And here's Port Gordon. These are the two that he said he forgot. So that was Rory Dahl. He said Roger died in Scotland in a nobleman's house where he left his harp and silver key to tune it. About 40 years after, a blind harper named Eklund Keane, a scholar of Lyons, whom I often met and an excellent harper, went over to Scotland and called at the house where Roger's harp and key were, and the heir of the deceased nobleman took a liking to Eklund and made him a present of the silver key, he being namesake to its former owner. But the dissipated rascal sold it in Edinburgh and drank the money. Rory Dahl never married. I knew a John O'Gara well. He was blind and born in the county of Sligo, a very good performer. He was called the Bawn of Coolavin, which I was informed by Charles O'Connor, the Irish antiquarian, had lost his estate by means of confiscation. He was offered part but declined. Then he forfeited the whole. He was a man of good qualifications. I met him in Bantry. So this fella Charles O'Connor, it says Charles O'Connor of Ballingarry. He was a direct ancestor of the present O'Connor Don and was one of the most distinguished Irish men of the 18th century. He was born at Kilmactrary, County Sligo, on the 1st of January 1710 and died at Ballingarry, County Roscommon, on the 1st of July 1791. He devoted his life to Irish studies and to the elevation of his Catholic countrymen. He collected many famous Irish manuscripts and wrote several works, the best known of which is his dissertation on the history of Ireland. Samuel Johnson wrote him two charming letters which are preserved. The Reverend Mr. Contrain, the uncle of Oliver Goldsmith, was a friend of his, and also he was a friend and patron of the Harper O'Carolan, and he declared that nowhere had Caroline's harp the same power as in his house. O'Carolan's harp is still preserved by the O'Connor Don at Clonellis. Charles O'Connor's valuable manuscripts, including the first part of the Annals of the Four Masters, were purchased by the Marquess of Buckingham and afterwards by Lord Ashburnham, and finally the government purchased them and presented them to the Royal Irish Academy, where they are now. So the memoir is going to say, I met a Ned Maguire. He was blind and he was a native of County Mayo. I was informed he played very well. I never heard anything particular of him, but that he was drowned in the Shannon at Limerick. I heard of a Matthew Ormsby, who was born in the County Sligo. I heard he was a good performer, but so peevish a creature that there was no enduring him. I knew Owen O'Donnell. He was born in the county of Roscommon. He was blind. He was a very genteel young man. I knew Andrew Victory. He was born in the county of Longford and was blind. I met him in several places. He played well and dressed very well. He told me he was once in the county Roscommon at the house of MacDermot Rowe, who says to him one day, Tonham an Gael, where were you the day the Battle of Culloden was fought? Alluding to the name Victory. Oxor, says Victory, it was well for the Duke of Cumberland I was not there, otherwise he would not have the honour of being called Billy the Butcher. I knew an Ellie Smith who was born in the county Cavan. She was blind. I often heard her play, which was tolerably well. In a former part of this narrative, I observed that I was almost stationary after my return from Munster and Connacht, in and about the county Cavan, these many years past. A little before the rebellion of 1798, I formed the idea of opening a school, which I proposed to my dear deceased friend Captain Somerville of Loch Sheelin in the county Cavan, who readily consented to erect one near his own house, and also to get me 3 scholars, and to have me live entirely with himself. But by means of the subsequent disturbances and the captain's death, the plan, of course, fell to the ground.